for joining us for workshop number 4 of Sembrando Salud 2022. Today we're going to talk about drought-tolerant crops and some history behind some of the drought-tolerant growing that has happened here in the Southwest and in New Mexico for a long time, many generations. And then near the end, we'll also talk about some tips and ways that you can kind of help beat the heat in your garden. And so without further ado, we'll just do some quick introductions. My name is Kate Rizuni. I'm the Associate Director for the Center of Southwest Culture. I'll let others introduce themselves and then we'll let you take it away for us, Emma.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Emma Dewey and I am the Farming and Gardening Manager for the Center of Southwest Culture. Thanks for being here.
Hi, good morning everyone. My name is Jose Manuel Castro Lopez. I am the Program Coordinator for Sembrando Salud and Policy. Thank you for being here.
Awesome. So like Katie said, this workshop is going to focus on drought tolerant growing and some ways to beat the heat. So yeah, drought tolerant growing. We're going to talk about some of the traditional crops here, just kind of the situation that we're in currently to give you some background. The map that you see on the slide, this is an extremely current map of the drought conditions in New Mexico. You can see on the map, it says 90% of New Mexico is in an extreme drought period. Over half of New Mexico is in an exceptional drought period. Even though we've received a little bit of rain this monsoon season, the precipitation that we get, unfortunately, is not enough to reverse any of the effects of this prolonged drought that we're going through right now. And the result of this drought is going to be that the landscapes across New Mexico are going to have to adapt. That's going to mean a lot of different things like forests dying off. It's not only the fires that have impacted our forest ecologies, but it's also just the heat in general that is causing mass die-off of lots of different types of trees. And so for both farmers and gardeners, for us to be able to continue to feed our communities, we have to adapt to the changing climate and find ways that we can continue to grow food. So one of the best ways to ensure that we can continue to grow food is to conserve water. If you are someone who has access to an acequia, it's important for you to continue to use your water so that you can hang on to your water rights. But if you can reduce or eliminate the practice of flood irrigation, that's going to prevent the majority of that water that you're using from evaporating. One of the ways that you can do that is to switch to drip irrigation systems. From the acequia, it's really easy to create a secondary pool that the water can flow into so that you can pump it out into a drip system. Utilizing timers for watering at night when the water evaporation rates are at their lowest. That's going to allow you to sleep in, but still take advantage of those particular hours that will allow your plants to retain the most water. Also implementing your soil health principles that we've gone over in our past workshops. Those are all going to aid in creating more water retention and just creating a more resilient micro ecosystem for your garden. You can also allow some of your garden beds, or if you have a larger space, maybe some fields or larger sections to rest for a year. And that way you are only watering a more concentrated area rather than trying to spread it out over larger spaces. And then also just select some crops that are adapted for drought conditions. And when those traditional diets were abandoned and replaced with more processed and refined commodity foods, that's really when we started to see a rise in like diabetes and obesity, cardiovascular disease, particularly amongst our BIPOC populations. So returning to cultivating these types of foods is a great way to not only return to more health in our communities, but also to help with conserving our environment. So yeah, just a little bit of history on that. Prior to the introduction of acequias by the Spanish back in the late 1500s, late 1400s, most farmers relied on the river and the tributary rivers and some of the other water sources that were here before things got messed up. And they were also dryland farmers, so they relied heavily on rainfall for watering their crops and their plants. And through many, many generations of growing these types of crops that they were growing, they were able to create seed banks of plants that were specifically acclimated to our soils here in New Mexico and to our climate, which is one of the amazing benefits of seed saving. Continuing to take plants or seeds from your healthiest plants over many years creates much more resilient plants down the road. So we'll also talk a little bit about how you can save seeds to continue that process. So some of the drought tolerant crops that the indigenous peoples here grew, they've been collected in different seed libraries. Some of the pueblos have their own seed banks. There are also some public libraries throughout the state that have a seed bank in place where you can actually go and either exchange seeds or you can take a couple. And typically the rule with that is that if you take some, you also need to leave some. So some of those different varieties include beans, lots of different kinds of corn. There's lots of grains that have kind of become like popular superfoods. Like you'll hear a lot of people talking about quinoa and chia seeds. Those were all grains that were originally grown by indigenous people in the southern portion of the globe. There's a lot of other different types of rice. Like normally we think of rice as requiring like really boggy, like very wet, wet conditions. But there were a lot of different varieties that were grown here that can just be grown in regular soil without needing any flood irrigation. Lots of different types of squash. There are so many. There are hundreds of different varieties of squash. Most popular ones in this region are like the yellow and the green squash. But yeah, there are so many different varieties. Next slide, please. Some of the other types of crops that can be grown are nuts. We don't really think of nuts really as being like a garden kind of crop, but if you think about just some of the like native species of trees that are around here, we use them a lot for landscaping purposes. Like pinon trees. We all have eaten piñons. So that is a really awesome tree to grow. It can provide lots of shade for your garden space also. Pecan trees also, it's actually one of the biggest exports from New Mexico. Is our pecan crop. And those trees do really well here in drought conditions once they're established. All trees need a little bit of water to get going, but once their roots are strong and sturdy, you can cut back on the water a lot. Acorns and walnuts are other ones that are really awesome. There's lots of different tomato varieties and chili, of course. The Cochiti chili and the Chimayo chili are actually considered to be some of the original species of chili that branched off into some of the more popular varieties that we're more familiar with, like the Hatch green chili. Trying to think of the other ones. But yeah, these were the original ones that were grown here, and through seed saving, we were able to develop those other varieties. There's also lots of different types of fruits. Prickly pear is kind of one of those underrated ones because we think of prickly pear typically as just being kind of like this roadside plant. Lots of people tear it up out of their yards because of all of the little spines in the cactus. But it's actually been scientifically proven to help regulate insulin levels. It's extremely beneficial in lowering bad cholesterol. And you can accomplish that either through eating the pads or the nopal, or by eating the fruits. And there's all kinds of different things that you can do with it. And then also there are different types of melons for every single pueblo in New Mexico. Every pueblo has their own type of melon that they've been growing over many, many, many generations. So if you have a chance to sample any of the melon that's coming from one pueblo or another, definitely try it. They're all going to be really different. So seed saving, like we talked about earlier, is one of the best ways to ensure that the plants that we're growing in New Mexico are going to continue to thrive. Through seed saving, we can develop different crop varieties, like the chili is a really good example of that, to create plants that are more acclimated for our area, both as far as heat tolerance goes and as well as just drought tolerance, so not requiring as much water. Thanks to diligent work of farmers and gardeners who are continuing those seed saving practices, we are beginning to see a lot more crops in New Mexico become hardier and more adapted to our climate, which enables our farmers and gardeners to be more successful and able to kind of combat these intense climate changes that we're seeing. So over time, the seeds that we share with one another are going to be even more well adapted to our desert climate. And that's just going to allow us to just continue growing food for one another for much, much farther into the future. The first thing that you should know when you are thinking about saving seeds is what type of plants you're going to be collecting the seeds from, or what the growth cycles of those plants are going to be. So there are 3 categories for the different growing cycles for different plants. One is annuals. So that means that the plant completes a full life cycle in one growing season, meaning that it goes from a seed to producing seed. Those are going to be plants like tomatoes, beans, chili, some herbs, and some different flowers also. Biennial plants are ones that produce seeds after their second year. So these are going to be things like carrots, onions, anything in the brassica family, which is going to be things like kale, cauliflower, cabbage, and broccoli. And then the last one is perennial plants. Excuse me, plants that are perennial produce seeds every year, and they will typically live longer than 2 years. So those are going to be things like fruit trees, grapes, different shrubs. Asparagus is an awesome perennial plant, artichokes. There's just a ton more. So now that we know what the growth cycles are of different plants, we'll want to make sure that we're saving seeds from plants that have the characteristics that you're after. So for you, maybe you're looking for, tomatoes that have a certain shape, or maybe they're especially big and juicy. Maybe there's a cool color that that your tomatoes turned, or maybe they're just exceptionally flavorful. So if any of your plants are producing those kinds of characteristics, save seeds from those plants, and that way you can continue that lineage of those characteristics. Always make sure that you're saving seeds from the healthiest plants. You don't want to collect anything from plants that look sick, or maybe just aren't thriving. Another tip is to save seeds from as many plants as possible. So if you're noticing those characteristics in multiple ones, try to save seeds from multiple plants, and that way you can diversify where those seeds are coming from. It's going to be really important that you somehow mark the fruits that you want to save for seed. And that's really just so that you can make sure that when you are harvesting, or if you send somebody else out to go and pick the vegetables from your garden, that they know not to pick those ones. You also want to make sure that the seeds that you collect aren't damaged. So if they look weird in any way, don't save those ones. Just save the ones that are totally intact and look normal. And then lastly, this one is super important. I always have a hard time with this, is to label your seeds. I always kind of think in my head that I'm going to remember next year what it was that I put in those little envelopes. That's never true. I never remember. So make sure that you label the variety of what you're saving and the date that you saved them, so that you can keep track of how long they've been in storage. So the techniques for seed saving, there are a few different ways that you can do this. For seeds that are wet, which are going to be things like cucumber, melon, squash, tomatoes, even things like eggplant. Those things you will want to soak the seeds in water and remove all of the pulp or the different plant matter that kind of sticks to the seeds. And you'll want to separate all the seeds from that stuff. Rinse all the seeds in a strainer. Make sure that if you're using a strainer that the holes are small enough that your seeds don't fall through. And you can always use like a paper towel if the holes are just too big, just layer that in there. And then you'll want to just lay the seeds flat on paper towels to dry. A tip that I just learned that is super helpful also is to sprinkle a little bit of cinnamon on the seeds, and that will prevent them from growing any mold, and then put them in storage. The second method is the dry method. And this one is probably the more common method that folks are familiar with. And this is going to be for any type of seed that turns into a seed head. So if you think about like a sunflower, the way that the seeds just dry like on the head of the flower. So in those cases, you just want to turn it upside down inside a brown paper bag and just sometimes you can just shake them out, the seeds, or you might also have to just kind of massage them out so that they fall. Some of the plants that you can do that with are things like lettuce. Corn is one of them. For corn, usually people will rub 2 of the cobs together so that you can loosen the kernels. Kale, okra, other types of greens, and lots of herbs or flowers can be saved that way. And then the exception is for beans and peas. For those ones, you want to allow the seed pod to dry out completely and turn brown on the plant. And then you can remove the seeds from the pods. It's best for those ones to just let them just dry on the plant. And then for storage, there's not necessarily a wrong way to save seeds, but there are slightly better ways. You should only use a Ziploc for seed storage if you are putting seeds in the freezer. Reason being, seeds actually do need some airflow to maintain their viability or their ability to germinate for the next season. So if you're storing your seeds, try to use something that is going to allow some airflow. So no Tupperware containers. Yeah, typically anything that's like plastic or like glass jars that can be sealed, not necessarily a good idea. But if you store them in something like paper envelopes or paper bags, that's going to be a better option. Seeds like to be stored in a cool and dark place away from sunlight. So if you think about their natural environment where seeds would be, they're probably going to be hiding like underneath some leaf mulch or something that allows them to be in the dark and in a cool environment. Seeds that you save in the freezer, they can last 10 years or more. Typically, other storage methods, you can expect seeds to stay good for about 2 to 3 years, and sometimes longer if you have them in the right environment. Perfect environment for seeds is going to be actually in your refrigerator. The ideal temperature is between 45 to 55 degrees with 25% humidity, which is basically what your refrigerator is at all the time with, some fluctuations and personal preferences. But yeah, if you can make a little space in your refrigerator specifically for seeds, that's the best place that you can keep them. Awesome. So I'm going to open it up for any questions if we have any at this point. And if not, we can just keep going. You can always ask questions at the end too, or on our Facebook page. Cool. So the next section of our workshop is on sun and heat mitigation strategies. The best defense for plants against the sun is going to be to make sure that you are using your healthy soil principles and putting those into practice. The reason for that is that having healthy soil with lots of abundant nutrients and the protection from mulch and different things that you're also using through soil health principles will help to build plant resilience against heat. And it'll also help them or help your soil to retain more water so that your plants always have that readily available. So again, keeping soil covered with mulch, that's going to help to keep the soil cool so it doesn't dry out. Mulch, in some cases, can reduce the temperature of soil on the top layer by like 15 to 20 degrees. So that is a super valuable way to help combat the heat in the summertime. Also, interplanting different types of companion plants next to your vegetables can help to build biodiversity in your garden. And it can also provide additional shade for both your soil and for other plants. The next best defense is to just get resourceful. It's always good to just try to use what you already have available to you. You don't have to go out and buy a bunch of different stuff to accomplish protecting your plants. Just get creative with using different materials that are either on hand, inexpensive, or are really easy to scavenge for. If you have some old sheets, maybe like a worn out tarp that has some holes in it, or maybe it's just super thin, or even some people use like empty animal feed bags, the stuff that's made out of that like woven plastic. All of those are things that you can recycle to use as a shade cover for your garden. If you have some extra wire fencing scraps laying around, that could create a really nice trellis or something that you can attach a shade cloth to create more shade. Scrap lumber, large tree limbs that you can use as posts, or even tree limbs as latillas for like a permanent shade structure. Those are all super inexpensive and easy ways to create more shade for your garden. So using other plants, that's one of the best ways that you can take advantage of just having more shade in your garden without having to do very much to get it. The best way to start with this is to just observe your garden each year and how the sun and the heat are impacting different areas. Typically, south-facing sections of your garden are going to take the brunt of the heat and the sun in the summertime. So keep that in mind, but there also might be some other areas that you're observing that are also getting dried out. And then when you're planning out your garden, keep those observations in mind so that you can strategically plant your protector plants that can provide shade in the summertime. So yeah, just look for the spots in your garden where maybe your plants got totally fried last year, or maybe you noticed that the tomato plants that you planted next to a bunch of sunflowers did a lot better than ones that you planted kind of off on their own. That's a super key observation. That's going to help you keep in mind what kinds of things to plant next to one another. And then just take notes and pictures so that you can remember what's working well or what isn't, so that you can make adjustments. Choosing your protector plants. So keeping your companion plants in mind, that's going to give you the best kind of hint at what you can grow next to one another that might accomplish having more shade. So for a good example, say that you need some shade for your tomato plants. We know that tomatoes grow really well next to sunflowers, like we mentioned earlier. They also grow well next to garlic, basil, chili, squash, and cucumbers. Just as a few examples, there's lots more. So consider how those different companion plants grow. Maybe there are different varieties of those plants either. That grow bushier, taller, or maybe they even like climb or vine. So taking advantage of those different growth types and materials that you have on hand can possibly create more shade. For example, in this picture that's on the slide, this is a picture that was taken from one of our gardeners last year. And you can see this awesome trellis that he created using cattle panels. And the squash that he has growing on there, actually it could be melon too, they look really similar. But growing something like that, that you know is going to create lots of vines and putting that over a trellis, that's a really, really, really creative and awesome way to provide more of that shade in your garden that you might need. The other option for creating shade, like we said earlier, is to use different materials. So shade cloth is the most common material that's used for creating shade in farming and gardening spaces. It's available from lots of different sources. I just got a huge roll for myself for pretty cheap on Amazon, and it's going to last me forever. It comes in different dimensions. It also comes in different colors and levels of UV protection. So it's a really awesome material that is pretty inexpensive. You can substitute shade cloth with other materials though, like old sheets or old tarps, any kind of fabric that is going to be lightweight, breathable, and still allows some light to get through, because you don't want your plants living in darkness. We just want to protect them. Another common way to set up, so one of the ways that you can apply shade cloth is to use hoops. That might actually be in the next slide, but another way is to set up shade cloth with 3 to 4 attachment points. So like using posts, or you can kind of see in this picture that Angelo, this is another picture from Angelo, he attached this shade cloth just using zip ties that he just connected to his trellis. And then on the other side, he has a couple of other T-posts. Those are the green and black colored posts that you see in the picture. And that's all you need. Those are super, super inexpensive. You can use the zip ties, baling, twine, wire, rope, anything that's going to be flexible and strong enough to keep it secured. Okay, yeah, so the other way is to put hoops over your garden beds and just secure the cloth over the top. And that basically is going to create like a little shade tunnel over your plants. There's a few different materials that you can use to make the hoops or use as hoops. They do make prefabricated metal hoops specifically for this purpose that you can purchase at hardware stores and also gardening supply stores. You can also purchase them online, but shipping might be a little expensive because they are heavy. And so those hoops, they're usually only about 3 to 4 feet wide and only about 3 feet high. So they're not ideal for covering taller plants because you want to make sure that they have enough space. But you can also make your own hoops out of PVC plumbing pipe, which is also really inexpensive. I think last time I checked, you could get a 12-foot length, I think in a 1/2-inch width for like $3 a piece. They're also really easy to scavenge. People throw scraps of this stuff away all the time. And it's super durable. 1/2-inch to 1-inch pipe is usually the best for using for hoops because it's going to be a lot more flexible and allow you to get that bend that you're going to need to create that arch. You can either secure them directly to your garden boxes. They make like little metal clamps that you can find, I think, in the, I think they're in the electrical section at hardware stores. And yeah, just attach them to the garden boxes, or you can attach them to T-posts, wrought iron, or anything else that you want to use as a post. And then the last thing is that you can also use the wire fencing or cattle panels like Angelo did in those last couple pictures. And you can create arches with those over your garden beds. That will also double as a trellis for climbing plants and provide a hoop structure for shade cloth. And those, I think Tractor Supply has them available for, I think it's like $25 for a 16-foot panel. And of course, there's all kinds of other different types of fencing that you can get that are pretty inexpensive too. Some other materials that you can try if you aren't into using like old sheets and tarps and things like that, or if you don't want to use shade cloth for whatever reason, you can also use bamboo fencing. It's biodegradable other than the little wire that they use to keep it together. Super effective. You can use lattice. It's also pretty inexpensive at hardware stores. It's also something that people tend to throw scraps away of a lot of times. And you can also just use patio umbrellas. Although in New Mexico, we have to battle the wind here. So sometimes those aren't practical, but if you have a way to secure them, those could be really useful also. Just remember to keep it lightweight, keep it breathable, and make sure that you can see through it so that you're not keeping your plants in total darkness. Awesome. So that was a lot of information to go over in a small amount of time. Does anybody have any questions on anything that we covered, or maybe anything that we didn't talk about? Awesome. Well, again, if you do think of any questions, you can always head to our Facebook group. We're always happy to answer any questions you have. You can also email us. Our upcoming workshops, this is actually our final educational one, but we will be doing some office hours where we can do a bilingual Q&A session, and that'll be happening toward the end of the month. And you can also check your emails and Facebook for the dates, times, links, and passwords and all that good stuff.
Oh, it looks like there's one. Oh, okay. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Yeah, all of those options are available to get in contact with us, and then we will share the dates of those Q&A times as soon as we finalize them. So thank you for joining us, everyone.